Data. Privacy.
Privacy rights versus the public's right to know.
Machines are ruled by algorithm, which are made by humans who are ruled by emotion.
Explores how the tension between First Amendment and privacy rights has developed within digital media in the modern age.
Failing to safeguard young people and their privacy.
Welcome back. This is episode 2, recorded on March 19th, 2023. Many years ago, LastPass was recommended and used by many security professionals, myself included. I stopped recommending LastPass in December of 2021. This is when it was announced that LogMeIn, now called Go2, was acquiring LastPass. This just did not sit well with me, concerns shared by many in the privacy and security community. In the world of cybersecurity, trust is a delicate thing, and when it comes to password management, trust is everything. For many years, LastPass had enjoyed a sterling reputation as a reliable password manager, boasting over 25 million registered users. As the user base of LastPass grew, it inevitably caught the eye of cybercriminals. And now we delve into the chilling aftermath, where trust hangs in the balance. In 2011, LastPass experienced its first notable security event, which, despite its severity, was handled with transparency and open communication. As a result, users remained loyal and trusting. Over a decade later, in August of 2022, the LastPass CEO confirmed a new security breach. An unauthorized party had gained access to portions of the LastPass development environment, taking source code and proprietary technical information. While this was certainly concerning, the CEO's transparency reassured the user base that master passwords were not compromised. Trust remained intact. In the following weeks and months, the updates grew more alarming. In November, the CEO revealed that the attacker had gained access to certain elements of customer information. Still, he maintained that user passwords were safely encrypted. However, in December of 2022, the CEO published an update that would change everything. It was confirmed the attacker had gained access to cloud storage used by LastPass to store archive backups of production data. It was revealed that not only basic customer account information, but customer vault data was also accessed and copied. The stolen vault data included encrypted and unencrypted data, with the encrypted data compromising more critical information such as usernames, passwords, secure notes, and form data. The CEO at LastPass emphasized that the encrypted data was indeed secured with 256-bit AES encryption and could only be decrypted with the master password. While this offered some comfort, it highlighted the potential for brute force attacks on weak or reused master passwords. At this point, the trust in LastPass began to wane, and users were advised to change their master passwords and all of the passwords stored in their vault. Security researchers were hired to investigate the breach, and LastPass urged customers to follow best practices to protect their master passphrases. However, the damage to trust had already been done, and the prospect of alternative password managers became more appealing to the users. The final bombshell dropped in March of 2023. It was revealed that a hacker had targeted a senior DevOps engineer by exploiting vulnerable third-party software. The attacker had successfully delivered malware that could bypass security controls and gain access to the cloud backups. The security incidents, the statement said, were not caused by any LastPass product defect, but the failure of corporate security processes and controls. Now, as this story unfolded, the once trusted LastPass found itself at the center of a trust crisis. The company's commitment to transparency, while commendable, could not repair the damage caused by this drip feed of information and the slow revelation of the true scope of the incident. The story of LastPass is a caution to us all, illustrating the importance of trust, transparency, and timely communication in the world of cybersecurity. It highlights the need for organizations to not only invest in robust security measures, but also to prioritize effective communication with their users. Once trust is broken, it can be incredibly difficult to rebuild. Today's episode is all about password managers, but I really want to stress the importance of why you should all be using a password manager. And it still surprises me that I speak to various folks, even in my industry, in technology and security, that don't use a password manager. It really is baffling. I'd like to point out that while this podcast is primarily focused on password managers, I will also be adding a section on two-factor authentication. This is sometimes known as TOTP, or time-based one-time passwords. Now, this is not going to be a review of all the different password managers out there. This is really going to be my personal choice. I'm going to pick 3 to discuss, which I believe are going to give you the best privacy and security with varying levels of practicality. Now, before we do, let me emphasize why it's so important to have a long, complex, unique password for every single site and service that you use. Now, if you listen to the last episode, you'll be more than familiar with data breaches and the fact they're happening pretty much every single day. Now, let's just say that in one of those data breaches in recent months, that my password was exposed. Now, I am oversimplifying this a little bit. I will go into things like password hashes and things like that later on in this episode. But for now, let's just assume an attacker has my password. Now, if that was for some online t-shirt company, and it just so happened I used a virtual credit card with privacy.com, my t-shirts were shipped to a UPS store, and I'm using a virtual phone number, and it's just a junk phone number I use for things like that, then I've minimized the impact of that breach. But what if I reused that password? It's the same password I've used for my email, for my online banking, for social media. Well, now the attacker has access to my other accounts. And the worst case scenario, if I've used that password for my email provider, well, now they can reset pretty much any of my accounts because the password reset email will hit the inbox which they now have access to. And again, this is why two-factor authentication is also really important, because even if they have your password from a breach or a phishing attack even, they've now got to have your two-factor authentication code to gain access to your account. Now, don't think because you are a very boring person with no social media presence and nothing of interest that you're not going to be a target. These attackers don't care who you are. If you want to steal someone's identity, do you think you want to steal the identity of a high-profile figure or the average Joe that's going to go under the radar? Probably the latter. These data breaches can contain thousands and thousands of exposed records on user accounts such as you and I. And they're not going to just pick 1 or 2 targets. They're going to go through the entire list and see where they get hits. And most often, this is going to be automated through scripts to see which passwords are working and which are not. As I mentioned in the story of LastPass, these data breaches often contain password hashes. Now, it can happen, but it's very rare that these breaches contain plain text passwords. In fact, when it does, it's normally all over the news. That's just really bad security by whoever's running that service. So what's a password hash? Okay, now bear with me. I'm going to get a little bit technical. A hash is essentially a unique fingerprint for some data. In this case, is our password. And it turns that password into a scrambled, fixed-length string of characters. So if you have a look at a hashed password, you'll just think it's a bunch of random letters. But this is designed to be a one-way thing, meaning that it's easy to create the hash from the data, our password, but very difficult to then reverse the hash back into the original data again. And then there's also something called salt. Now, I'm not talking about hash browns and salt, although that sounds very tempting. A salt is a random piece of data that's added to the password before hashing it. So if I have my password, which is blue sky $, it's not really my password, by the way, just an example. My salt could be mountains. I'm really oversimplifying it here. But this makes it much more difficult for attackers to guess the original password because now they need to consider both the password and the salt together. Now, websites like hashes.com or tools like John the Ripper, they try and crack hashes by guessing what the original password might be. Now, they do this by trying lots of different password guesses, hashing each guess, and then comparing it to the original target hash. We can use techniques like testing common words, trying all possible combinations, using pre-compiled tables of hashes. Okay, let's dive a little bit deeper and go into more depth on how tools like John the Ripper do this. First is dictionary attacks. These are attacks that use a pre-compiled list of common words and phrases to guess your password. The attacker hashes each of the words in the dictionary and then checks if the resulting hash matches the target. This is why it's so important to have a complex password, because if it's just Easter egg, then it's very likely to be in the dictionary. And I'm not talking about the dictionary you buy in the bookstore. The way a brute force attack works is that we're going to try all possible combinations of characters and numbers and special characters even for the plain text password. We'll hash each attempt and then check to see if that hash is a match. So my father actually asked me this question a few months ago, and that's, why can't they just lock you out after, say, 5 unsuccessful attempts at guessing your password? Well, that's true if the attacker is targeting a web page with a login form, for example. But this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about hashes retrieved from data breaches or perhaps stolen in some other way. But once they have the hash, you can now crack that to your heart's content offline. Okay, so I may have been going off track just a little bit, but I want you to understand how easy it is for attackers to retrieve a hash, perhaps from a data breach, and crack that password. So the more simple the password is, the more likely it's been seen before and appear on sites like hashes.com, but also the more likely it is to be cracked. Now, hackers are also privy to the fact that if you have a regular word, but you have special characters in there, perhaps password spelt PA$W0RD, well, that's well known now. There's tools now that can easily incorporate that into the brute force methods. So to be truly protected, you need 2 things. A very long, complex password, and I'm talking at least 22 characters or more, in my opinion, with numbers, special characters, uppercase and lowercase letters. And on top of that, in case that ends up in a breach, you have 2-factor authentication. And on top of that, make sure you have a unique password for every single site. In fact, I would go as far as having a unique email address for every single site. But we'll leave that for another podcast episode. Okay, so hopefully you won't be too shocked if my first recommendation is not LastPass. If you're still using LastPass today, please don't freak out. Hopefully you've changed your master password and all the passwords of the services you used. If you haven't, go and do it now. Okay, first off, we have 2 choices. We can use an online cloud-hosted password manager. So that's going to be something like BitWarden, Dashlane, or 1Password. And these store the passwords in an encrypted vault on their servers. And I say their servers, they're more than likely hosted in the cloud, so with Amazon Web Services, for example. But these allow you to access your passwords from any device as long as you have an internet connection. The benefit of an online password manager is that it's incredibly convenient. It's very easy to set up, it's very accessible, and you've got automatic syncing of your passwords across all those devices. The downside is, well, it's online, so it needs an internet connection, but also it could be a potential target for hackers. Look what happened to LastPass. Now, the other option is an offline password manager. So this is going to be something like KeePass or BitWarden. Now, I've already mentioned BitWarden is an online password manager, but BitWarden is open source. You can completely self-host BitWarden on your own device with no internet connection required. However, BitWarden and KeePass, being local offline password managers, now adds a layer of complexity because you have to manage syncing across devices. But one of the benefits is you don't need that internet connection to access your passwords, and you have greater control over the storage of your password database. Now, when choosing a password manager, I typically look at the following things. First of all, who is the company or the developers behind it? The very reason I stopped using LastPass back in December 21 was just the fact I didn't trust LogMeIn, and they'd announced this acquisition. Now, especially since once they acquired LastPass, they started charging, I think it was about 4 times as much. And there was just a lack of transparency from LogMeIn on privacy issues. And I had this general feeling of unease. Now, that's really all it takes for me. And I don't want to say I told you so for those that are still on it. As I mentioned earlier, trust is a very delicate thing. Now, the other thing I look at is open source versus closed source. Now, there's this debate that can go on between open source and closed source software, which is more secure. Security and privacy are often cited as key factors. Now, while open source software is preferred due to its transparency and accessibility, it doesn't mean it's superior in any way as it comes down to security or privacy. Open source literally just means its source code is publicly accessible, so it can be freely reviewed, modified, and redistributed by anyone. Because of this transparency, you now have the community involved, allowing this community of developers and security experts to scrutinize and contribute to the project if they wish to do so. Now, in theory, the more eyes on the code, the more likely it is for security vulnerabilities to be identified and fixed. However, remember, this is based on the project having an active community and engagement and contributions being thoroughly reviewed before implementation. Smaller or less popular open source projects may not receive the same level of attention, leaving a potential for vulnerabilities to remain undiscovered. Now, while I can write code from time to time, I'll be honest with you, I'm not a developer. Looking at the code myself is only going to take me so far, and frankly, I don't have the time. Okay, let's talk about closed source software for a moment, or proprietary software. This is typically developed and maintained by a single company or organization, and its source code remains private. Now, in this model, the software's security and privacy does depend on the expertise and the vigilance of the development team and the organization that backs it. However, to enhance security, many closed source companies do offer bug bounties. These are financial rewards for security researchers who discover and then report vulnerabilities in the software. I really like this. These programs incentivize external cybersecurity experts to scrutinize the software, and they're doing it for money, effectively crowdsourcing security testing without revealing the source code. Software companies of closed source software may also invest in security audits, hiring independent firms to assess the security measures and identify any vulnerabilities. Now, security audits can be really expensive. These range from tens of thousands to potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, ultimately, the security and privacy of the software you use does depend on the quality of its implementation and the vigilance of its developers, rather than whether it's simply open source or closed source. We really must look at things like what's the reputation of the developer or organization, whether it's open source or not. If it's open source, how active is the development of the product? How often is it being updated? Does it have a large community backing? How responsive and transparent have they been in the past? These are all things we need to consider. Now, while open source offers the advantage of transparency and a community backing, that doesn't guarantee that it has superior security or privacy, certainly not when compared to closed source. That said, my personal preference is still open source. I would much rather be able to participate in the community, look at the issues, look at how many updates the application's receiving, and just see the active engagement in some open source software versus the closed doors of a proprietary solution. Anyway, I think we've exhausted that. Let's look at both options and what I would recommend personally. Now, I'm going to start with the most convenient and, funnily enough, the most expensive first. And as I work my way through, it will be the least expensive as it goes into free and open source, but ultimately the more complex to set up. Okay, let me start with Dashlane. This is the most expensive option, and as a result, I've actually ruled this out. Now, not just because it's the most expensive. The other issue I have with Dashlane is there's no standalone desktop application. For some reason, they discontinued this last year in 2022. Now, I have no doubt that Dashlane has undergone extensive security audits. They're a private closed source company, but I just couldn't find much out there about this. Now, maybe they just don't want to share the reports as openly as other companies do. Now, they do offer a bug bounty with HackerOne. This is basically a monetary reward. In this case, it ranges from $200 to $5,000 from what I could see. And if a hacker finds a vulnerability, or any cybersecurity professional, I should say, then they can get this reward. I would argue, though, that $200 to $5,000 may not be worth the time of some of the more experienced security researchers. Now, I did find a security white paper, which I'll link in the show notes. But given this is the most expensive option, I really don't see what other benefits it's bringing, especially since they don't have that desktop app. Okay, next we have 1Password. This is something I do recommend in certain situations, but first let me just talk a bit more about it. One of the things I like is that it undergoes regular security audits. Now these, as I mentioned before, are very expensive. Now I had a look, and firms like Cure53, SecVault Security, ISE, I think they're called Independent Security Evaluators. These are reputable companies, by the way, and these are expensive audits to have undertaken. But they're sharing these. You can look at the reports, and I like the fact they're sharing these online. In terms of price, you still have to pay. I think it's $3 or $2.99 a month for an individual. But I think where this will shine is if you have a family and you want to make sure everyone is using a password manager. And for that, it's $4.99 a month. But to be fair, I think that's fairly reasonable. I would place this higher in terms of ease of use and usability than some of the other password managers. They also have a bug bounty with Bug Crowd, and they offer, I think, $50 to $30,000 per vulnerability. So that's a lot higher than Dashlane. But what I really like is in 2022, they were doing this Capture the Flag event with a $1 million reward. So there's a lot of incentive to find security flaws in the product. As for privacy, Agile Bits, who are the company behind 1Password, seem to be reputable. In fact, Jeff Shiner is their CEO, and Troy Hunt, who runs the Have I Been Pwned website, is on their board of directors, which is no surprise then that Have I Been Pwned is integrated into 1Password. And unlike Dashlane, they have a desktop app. In fact, all the other password managers I'm going to talk about do as well. It's just Dashlane seems to have thrown that out the window for some reason. So again, I think the value of 1Password, if you have a family, a wife, a husband, kids, and you want to make sure they're all using a password manager and securing their online presence, then this is a great option. $3 to about $5 a month, depending on what you need there. Right, now we enter the realm of open source password managers. And let's start with BitWarden. Now, this has gained popularity just due to its transparency, and there's a large community behind it, but it has a very strong security record and a growing user base. I've been recommending this for a number of years, primarily because it's free and it's a low barrier of entry. The features in the free version are pretty extensive. It really gives you everything you need. There's no restrictions on the number of passwords or devices or apps you can use or anything like that. Now, their paid option is very cheap. It's $10 a year. Now, the features the paid option gives you is things like two-factor authentication. I personally don't recommend that. I just don't like having all my eggs in one basket. I think the idea of a password manager and two-factor authentication, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, is to have them separate. But when it comes down to families, so again, if you have a husband or a wife and kids, their paid option for families is $3 a month or around $40 a year. And that's up to 6 accounts, and you have all the features of premium, I believe. But again, what I like about BitWarden is the transparency. It's open source. They also have security audits. They've used Cure 53 and Insight Risk. There's a bug bounty with HackerOne, although I don't think they offer any financial reward, but given this is open source and they're charging so little, that's no surprise. That doesn't concern me. Okay, so I do recommend BitWarden for my friends and family. The main reason being is that it's free. And often when I'm recommending privacy and security products to friends or family members, if they have to pay for it, I just get that much more resistance. In fact, I had a hard enough time trying to get people to use Signal. I'll talk more about that perhaps in another episode. And a point I'd like to make with any password manager, particularly the online ones, is the master password or this encryption key. The company behind the password manager should have zero knowledge of your master password. They should not be able to retrieve it. If you lose it, there should be no way they can reset your account. For me, it raises a major red flag if I look through their support website and it says, if you lose your master password, contact us for account recovery. I will not go near it. If there's any way the support team can access your password vault through some sort of account recovery process, then so can a hacker. Okay, so for this section of the podcast, we're going to start wearing our tinfoil hats. This is for the more privacy conscious of you. Up until now, I've talked around these hosted platforms, 1Password and BitWarden, for example. And it's been focused on convenience and practicality. It's the idea of this podcast. But if you are concerned just having your password vault in the cloud, available online, with the future potential of someone cracking that, perhaps there's advances in quantum cryptography and someone can gain access to that in the future, then you are going to want to store an offline password vault. So, tinfoil hats on. By self-hosting BitWarden, you then maintain control over your data and mitigate these risks associated with trusting a third party with our sensitive information. Now, the setup with BitWarden allows us to run our own server and then store the password vault on our own hardware that we control. This could be a laptop or a dedicated server in your home. You could run this in the cloud, but then I do question the benefit of that versus their own cloud option. Now, this option is for those that really want to focus on privacy. And I would say over security, but this is still a very secure option. This is a really important point I'd like to make, actually. Google, for example, many in our privacy community will be de-Googling their lives. They don't have Google on their devices, and Google is bad. But if you look at Google from a security point of view, it's incredibly secure. They have some of the best security in the industry. If I try and access a Google account, it's going to want to verify who I am. It's going to send a code or authorization request to another device, for example. They do a lot to stop someone hacking into your account. For privacy, it's a disaster. Okay, now it's important to consider that the costs associated with self-hosting BitWarden, you will need a server or computer. Now, if you have an old laptop lying around, as I said, then it's going to be, you could use that. It's going to be low cost. Now, BitWarden does run as a Docker container. So for the more technical among you, this shouldn't be an issue. But if you're new to this, then there's going to be a steep learning curve. You need to obtain an SSL certificate as well. Plus, you're going to have ongoing costs as running this thing all the time. So do bear that in mind. Now, let's talk about KeePassXC. This is the next option in self-hosting a password manager. Unlike BitWarden, KeePassXC is an offline password manager that stores your passwords in an encrypted database file. There's no need for any server or internet connection to access your password vault. This makes it an ideal choice for those who want this entirely local solution, such as myself. I am a primary user of KeePassXC. I've actually been using it for, feels like 100 years. Several years now I've been using this. Now, the main advantage of KeePassXC is it is actually simple. There is no need to set up and maintain a server. You don't have to purchase a domain name or an SSL certificate to run this. Installation is straightforward. You just install the app and tell it where to store the file. Again, if you're going to use cloud storage, then I start to question, well, why not just use BitWarden and then take advantage of all the security controls they have around that? If you don't configure that cloud storage correctly or that gets exposed, then someone has a copy of the database. That said, they then have to break into that database file. The offline nature of KeePassXC also makes it less susceptible to targeted attacks. In the event of a large-scale breach of a cloud provider, but your data is not at risk because the database file is just stored locally on your machine. This is a really important consideration. If you're going to prioritize privacy and security and you want to minimize your threats, then storing this offline is the best option. But that comes with some downsides. The most obvious here is just the lack of built-in synchronization. When you choose your own method for synchronizing your password database, it requires manual setup and additional services. I use Nextcloud. Now, I use Nextcloud not just to synchronize my password, but for all of my file storage needs. I have a home lab. I have multiple servers and disk arrays. I've got quite a complex setup. It's certainly not in the realm of practicality or for the average Joe. Again, you could run Nextcloud on a laptop, but you've got the same problems. You need to run that laptop 24/7, have a domain name, SSL certificates, and you have that added layer of complexity. If that's the path you want to go down, however, that's what I do. KeePass running on Nextcloud. And by the way, my Nextcloud instance is not exposed to the internet at all. This is entirely local to my network. It actually works really well. Now, my mobile phone runs Graphene OS. I have a Google Pixel. It's a de-Googled phone running Graphene OS. So for those of you in the privacy world, you'll know exactly what that is. If I take a photo on my phone and I'm out, it gets queued up. As soon as I get home and it has a connection to my Wi-Fi and my Nextcloud server, it uploads that photo automatically. My password manager is also integrated with Nextcloud. So as soon as I get home and I have a connection, it's always running the latest version of that database file I was mentioning for KeePass. Now, KeePassXC also has multiple applications for desktop, mobile devices, many of which, by the way, are third-party applications. Be careful which ones you're downloading. And this is where you have to tread more carefully. Make sure you're downloading KeePassXC. There's KeePassDX for Android, for example. If you're on iOS, there's Strongbox. I recommend Strongbox. It's a very good integration to your KeePass database. So in terms of security, both self-hosting BitWarden and KeePassXC offer strong encryption to protect your data. Now, obviously, the choice is yours, and it depends on your priorities and also your skill level. If, like me, you're technical and you don't have any issue with running your own Nextcloud server and you want to run KeePass and do all that, great. That's what I do. That's probably the strongest option out there. Otherwise, my recommendation is BitWarden. But take a look at 1Password, have a look at the free trial, and if you prefer it, go for it. That's certainly not an issue. The only reason I recommend BitWarden is, again, there's that free option. It's open source. I just like the community behind it. I like how rigorous security has been assessed. But here's one big caveat I'd like to make. 3 years ago, I was recommending LastPass. It was a fantastic password manager, and things changed. As this podcast becomes out of date, perhaps someone acquires BitWarden or 1Password. Perhaps there's a huge controversy with KeePassXC. My recommendation is to stay vigilant and up to date with what's going on. What I'm recommending today may not be my recommendation next year or in 3 years' time. Okay, if you want to self-host KeePassXC with Nextcloud, let me just share very briefly what I do. I run a Linux virtual machine running Ubuntu. It has full disk encryption with something called Lux disk encryption. Nextcloud is installed natively on that. I'm not using containers or Docker. And I have an internal only domain name, which can only be resolved on my Wi-Fi. So there's no public facing domain name. I use Let's Encrypt for my SSL certificate. That's free. And I run Nextcloud on all devices in the home. So my kids have an account, my wife has an account, I have an account. That's our file sync option. KeePass, the database file, just happens to be in my Nextcloud directory. So it's automatically synced. If I lose my disk drive in my PC, I don't care. It's also on the Nextcloud server. However, if that gets corrupted somehow, then I rely on a backup. I have spent a considerable amount of time researching the best way to do backups. I've looked at online backup services, but I didn't like the fact that they could potentially access my data or have access to the decryption key with encrypted backups. And this is probably going to be a longer discussion for another podcast episode. But let me give you a quick overview of what I do. That Nextcloud Linux VM, it's a virtual machine running Ubuntu, runs Restic. Restic takes a snapshot or backup of the entire data drive and sends it to Backblaze B2. Backblaze B2 is object storage in the cloud. But because Restic is doing an encryption first before it gets sent to the cloud, that's fully encrypted in the cloud. There's no way Backblaze can decrypt that data without the key, the password. They have no knowledge of that, and neither could they. They're two separate things. Restic is doing the backups and encryption, and it's just happening to use a repository, which is Backblaze B2 in the cloud. Then locally, my PC is obviously running the Nextcloud client, so my PC is synchronized with the Nextcloud server. And I also have Nextcloud on my mobile devices as well. For iOS, I used to use Strongbox, but now I've moved over to Graphene OS. I'm using KeePassDX. And KeePassDX has integration with Nextcloud. I can't remember if Strongbox does, but what I used to do is basically have a copy of that in Strongbox. And the benefit of that is if I'm traveling, Strongbox is using a copy of that database. It's basically my own offline version. If something was to happen on my Nextcloud instance, got corrupted with all that data, I could either restore that from Backblaze B2, or I have a copy with Strongbox. Okay, I've probably gone too far down the rabbit hole. This is meant to be a practical privacy podcast. So for the practical among you, go with 1Password or BitWarden. You can't go wrong. But I cannot talk about password managers without talking about two-factor authentication. If your password is exposed, perhaps through a data breach or a phishing attack, The next level of defense is a two-factor authentication code. So you've probably heard of Google Authenticator. I would strongly recommend against using SMS. As I said in episode 1 of this podcast series, SMS is vulnerable to SIM swap attacks. If you have no choice, then make sure you use a virtual phone number with MySudo, for example. But for everything that supports it, use a proper two-factor authentication token. Now for that, you have some options. There is Google Authenticator. There's other apps out there. Android has an app called Aegis. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's spelled Aegis. And OTP is another one, but that's no longer maintained. That used to be highly recommended. And then there's Authy. So let's start off with Google Authenticator. This is probably the one that most people are familiar with. It's Google. That doesn't go well with us privacy enthusiasts. But I also should mention it doesn't support multiple devices unless you manually add the authorization code for each service at the time. So when you get that QR code, you have to do it twice. That's not practical at all. There's also no native backup built into Google Authenticator itself. So unless you have, for each service, these backup codes in the event you lose the Authenticator device, there's no backup with the Authenticator app itself. Now, Aegis is another one. There's a workaround to it being Android only if you wanted to run this on your desktop, but that's using BlueStacks, which is an Android emulator. I'm not doing that. That's something I want to avoid. If I lose my phone, I personally don't have another Android device. Also, I prefer to have a backup two-factor authentication app on another device, such as my desktop PC. I mentioned and OTP. This is no longer maintained. Really nothing to discuss there. It used to be quite heavily recommended, but from what I can tell, that it's getting pretty out of date. Authy. This is one that I would recommend, and some of you in the privacy world may be cringing at that. First of all, that you're cringing because it's not open source. There are concerns over the privacy policy. It's very generic. And also, privacy folks have raised concerns because Authy uses your phone number as an identifier. When you sign up to Authy, they also request an email address. Authy uses an identifier for your account, which can be tied back to this phone number and email. They will also have metadata on what apps you have set up. Now, when you scan a QR code, inside that QR code, it's going to have information such as the service, like Twitter, and then the username and password. First off, from the practical point of view, if I lose my mobile phone, say it gets destroyed, I don't want to have to rely on backup codes for every service. I may have missed one. Some are more easy than others. When you sign up for two-factor authentication with Fastmail, for example, or ProtonMail, they will give you a list of backup codes you can store in your password manager. Great. My online banking app doesn't give me that option, so I have to take a copy of the QR code or the actual code itself as a backup. Now, I do use Authy. I'll tell you why. First, I use MySudo. The phone number I use for Authy is not tied to my real name, and I don't use that phone number for anything else. It's absolutely dedicated to Authy. For some of the more privacy wary of you out there, they get freaked out at this. Remember, I need to look at this from both a privacy and security point of view, keeping practicality in mind. Second, for email, I use an alias. Now, this will be discussed in more detail in a future episode, but I use Simple Login. This is now owned by Proton, by the way. I have my own custom domain name, which is very generic, like abc123mail.com. It's not that, but that's the kind of thing I use. Now, we talked briefly about domain names in the last episode, and I actually have two separate accounts for these domain names with Namecheap, one for my personal stuff and the other one for these alias. I'm probably revealing too much now, so moving on. The primary reason I use Authy is that if I lost access to my mobile device and all my two-factor authentication codes, it would be a disaster. I've put it to the test to see how easily I can recover my two-factor authentication codes, while also considering how perhaps a hacker would gain access. To recover your Authy account, you need access to either the phone number or a device where Authy is already installed. And this is the key. It supports multiple devices. I have Authy installed on my desktop, my mobile device, and a backup device. You will also need your backup password, which I store in KeePassXC. This is needed to activate your two-factor authentication accounts. So even if someone was to break into my home, and gain access to my desktop if I was stupid enough to leave it logged in and unattended. Even if they authorize their device as an extra device for my Authy account, they then need the backup password before they can even use any of the two-factor authentication tokens. Now, for me, this is the most secure, most private and practical way of managing two-factor authentication, and it's certainly what I recommend to my friends and family. Now, Authy itself is a part of Twilio. Twilio is, I've always known them as a virtual phone number company. It's probably a very basic term. And I believe they're the technology that provides phone numbers to MySudo. Now, worst case scenario here that I can think of is they don't know who I am through the phone number. That's unique. I have a unique email address. But they do know who I am. Perhaps I've got Twitter, two-factor authentication, and my Twitter account is @RayHeffer. So if they see that, they know exactly who it is. And I'll be honest here, that's my biggest concern, is the privacy of using Authy. And I feel quite conflicted, but right now, the importance and the primary reason I'm using Authy is because I've got that backup on multiple devices. And as I do more research here, I will update you on this podcast. One of the other concerns I have is they seem to have a process to recover an Authy account if you don't have access to either another device or the phone number associated with the account. Now, I would hope they can only recover this if you have the backup password. And if you have neither of those three, then they should not be able to recover at all. I'm actually going to put this to the test, and when I do, I will share that here. And if you want to stay 100% private and secure with two-factor authentication, I would strongly recommend Aegis. Despite it being Android only, I think this is the best option out there right now. And then you may be wondering, what about physical hardware tokens like Yubikey? That is the strongest recommendation I can make. I'm not going to cover that in this podcast. This is going to go out of scope. The problem with Yubikey is not all services support it. Some of them are expecting Google Authenticator. In fact, the majority of them do. But yes, I use Yubikey as well. I think it's a very strong option. Now, this has been going for over 40 minutes, so I'm going to end the podcast there. You can actually email me now. It's privacy@lockdown.media. I would love to hear from you to see if you agree, disagree, or if you have some other ideas or topics you want to discuss on the future podcast episode. Stay safe out there and talk to you next time.